We're returning to the theme of how Lacanian psychoanalysis or Lacanians would work with dreams clinically. We're going to pose a couple of questions and then we're going to jump into a little bit more detail, seminar 2, particularly Lacan's important engagement and discussion of Freud's famous specimen dream of psychoanalysis, the Irma's injection dream. In order to do that, I just want you to cast your minds back a little bit and give you a kind of narrative introduction to one of the dilemmas that we will be facing. So I think it's around 2007. It's central London, Mallet Street, if you want to know the address. It is a bookstore, Waterstones, I believe. It's the basement. It's a kind of funky, cold, autumnal Saturday afternoon. There's a group of us, we're all trainees, we're struggling along with this book. We struggled along with seminar 1. We had this idealistic idea, we're going to read it all word for word, out aloud amongst us, drinking too much coffee, reading, intently trying to get what's going on with Irma's dream. So that's one piece of context. A related piece of context, at least for me this time, was that just a few months prior to that, I was lucky enough to have been involved in a kind of workshop mini conference, the whole topic of which was looking at the multiple papers, the growing, spiraling literature of different psychoanalysts, and not just psychoanalysts, structural thinkers, existential thinkers, who've all wanted to say something about Freud's dream of Irma's injection. It was a great idea. I recommend trying to do it. But what soon becomes apparent is people have a lot to say about this dream. People have a lot of interpretations to make about the dream. One of those papers that's kind of most famous in that literature is Erik Erikson's paper on the dream, which Lacan engages with. Interestingly, Lacan, being Lacan, is going to be a bit critical of a number of things that Erikson does, but he's also going to note a couple of things that are of significance. He even agrees with something that Erikson says. And maybe I'll note that right from the outset. We'll say what happens in the Irma's injection dream, but let's just say simply that you could say it's quite an anxiety-provoking dream. And one of the remarks that Erikson makes, which Lacan endorses and thinks is a good remark, is why doesn't Freud wake up? Freud's very account of anxiety-provoking dreams involves the idea that when a great deal of anxiety or a great deal of unconscious material starts to come to the fore, it's almost as if the preconscious is like, whoa, there's too much, I can't handle this, the dream work's not doing enough disguising. Pull the like emergency alarm button, sorry, you push an emergency alarm button, wake the guy up or the person up. So that's part of what Freud's idea is, that like the little guard who's watching over the citadel, most things can be handled in the course of the night, you don't have to wake everyone up, but when the threat is too great, you have to wake up the whole citadel, whatever. So that's a kind of intriguing remark. Why doesn't Freud wake up in the course of a very anxiety-provoking dream? So we'll leave it at that. But nevertheless, circling back to my context, going to a Freud conference and looking at all these interpretations, and people, it's an endless array of different associations, you could say imaginary associations, egoic associations that people have to Freud's dream. There's a lot. And then we get to Mallet Street and we're reading and we hear about the dream, and Lacan delivers this statement. The dream, we'll read it quickly just to give you the context, but there's a moment when Lacan seems to give a kind of perplexing remark. So first off, let me give you a brief description of the dream taken from Freud, repeated here by Lacan, and then I'll note this kind of perplexing moment that Lacan points to. So says Lacan, here is an extract from the dream, and he's citing Freud. So I'll do my best Freud impersonation. A large hall, many guests whom we receive. Among them is Irma, whom I immediately take aside, as if to answer her letter and reproach her that she doesn't accept the solution yet. I say to her, if you are still having pains, it is really only your fault. She answers, if you knew what pains I now have in my throat, my stomach and my abdomen, it's tightening me up. I'm startled and I look at her. She looks pallid and puffy. I think, after all, I am overlooking something organic. I take her to the window and look into her throat. With that, she shows some resistance, like women who wear a denture. I think to myself, she doesn't need to do that. Her mouth then opens properly, and I find on the right a large white spot. And elsewhere, I see some remarkable curled structures, which evidently are patterned on the nasal turbinal bones, extensive white-grey scabs. I quickly call Mr. D, not Mr., sorry, Dr. D, who repeats and confirms the examination. No, Dr. M, sorry, Dr. M, who repeats and confirms the examination. Dr. M looks entirely different from usual. He's very pallid, limps, is beardless on the chin. My friend Otto now stands next to her, and my friend Leopold percusses her over the bodice and says she has a dullness below on the left. Points down to the infiltrated portion of the skin on the left shoulder, which I, in spite of the dress, just as he, feel. M says, without a doubt it's an infection, but it doesn't matter. Dysentery will follow and the poison will be eliminated. We also directly know where the infection comes from. Recently, my friend Otto, when she was not feeling well, gave her an injection, a preparation of propylene propionic acid, trimethylamine, whose formula I see in heavy type before me. One doesn't give such injections so lightly. Probably too, the syringe wasn't clean. So that's the extract. Now, in the course of the various historical examinations of the dream, the attempt to locate exactly who Irma was, the attempt to locate who all of these characters in the dream are, Lacan himself has things to say about who all these three friends are, these three people are that Freud looks to try to be, to have an excuse for what's happening to Irma, which is clearly pretty awful. And he doesn't want to be guilty of what her suffering is, and he appeals to these three men. In a less than charitable section, Lacan says, these three idiots, or as I prefer, the three non-wise men, that he wants to try to get to absolve him of the crisis of the medical suffering of what's going on with Irma. So there's an awful lot to be said there, even in terms of the idea of, has she accepted the solution yet? And of course, solution means both a solution, a resolution to a problem, but also it has a medical sense of something you imbibe, a solution. So there's an awful lot to be said about that. So as I already suggested, a lot of people have a lot of things to say. But there we are, back to Mallet Street, too much coffee in the basement. We're reading, and at a certain section of his understanding of what's going on in the Irma dream, Lacan includes this, which is the chemical formula for trimethylamine. And he says, this explains everything, trimethylamine. Like my oracle, the formula gives no reply whatsoever to anything. But the very manner in which it is spelled out, its enigmatic, hermetic nature, is in fact the answer to the question of the meaning of the dream. Full stop. It's hard to explain, but we were stumped. Okay, that is the meaning of the dream. This moment where it seems almost everything is reduced to this symbolic inscription. It's kind of like saying, well, this thing, which is a kind of exemplar of non-meaning, it is the meaning. Now, you may be hearing a little bit something of a resonance with the conundrum, the paradox I mentioned in the first session, which was, what does one do for an interpretation of a dream? Maybe one refuses to interpret a dream. Maybe one stops the session so that the person feels that they need to go on. Or, and here's another one, which is actually entirely Freudian, one takes one minute, seemingly displaced, seemingly trivial element and shows great interest in the fact that the shoes in the dream were brown. Of course they were brown! End of session. But what Lacan seems to do here, he says, this explains everything. What does that mean? Well, it means that he's hystericizing us. And I can say that of that group that was there, at least one of my colleagues has also gone on to try and write further about this dream and think about it. In other words, he hystericized us. He didn't give, well, he does go on to give something of a more contextual, meaningful kind of engagement with the dream. But this is a kind of emblematic, almost you could say ethical, hystericizing gesture. This point of non-meaning is the meaning. which means you as a subject and as an analysand need to continue to work to think what it means. So 2 more comments on this. Sometimes I've heard colleagues talk about this as a kind of point of symbolic reduction. What does that mean? It means it becomes a kind of point of symbolic density, which is a way of suggesting that this means a lot. There's a lot of meaning in here, but we don't know what it is, okay? So a symbolic reduction is a kind of enigmatic point, an enigmatic condensation of a lot of kinds of potential meanings that we do not yet know what they are. See, my dog, I think, has a suggestion that they do know what it is. Last point to make about the symbolic reduction is that it is one way of thinking of Freud's famous notion of the navel of the dream. What is the navel of the dream? The navel of the dream is a point beyond which one cannot interpret. And this seems to be very clear here. So we will return to other parts of the dream, but just to highlight that, it was a very dramatic and useful point for me. But I wanted to note another kind of research question for us as we continue thinking about Freud's interpretation of dreams. So Bruce Fink has recently produced a lovely book, which is an engagement with a reading of this seminar. This is seminar 6, Desire and its Interpretation. And in this book, we have Lacan engaging with Ella Sharp. I don't know why I'm showing you the book because you can barely even see the title of it. But Ella Sharp has a book called Dream Analysis. So Lacan spends a long time working with one of the dreams and one of the interpretations that Ella Sharp speaks about. This features very much strongly in Bruce Fink's book, and he makes a couple of remarks. And I just want to highlight 2 of them because when we go back to Irma's dream, we can think about these questions and see how they might slightly differentiate a Lacanian approach to dreams from a Freudian approach. The first remark is to say, and I'm going to quote Bruce Fink here, Lacan takes up quite a few dreams involving death, including the well-known Father, can't you see I'm dreaming? Father, can't you see I'm burning dream? That's good. Father, can't you see I'm dreaming? Father, can't you see I'm dreaming? Lacan takes up quite a few dreams involving death, including the well-known Father, can't you see I'm burning dream, and a dream that Trotsky has also involving death. Now here's the key point. Interpreting a dream for Lacan often involves situating the role of death in the dream and in the dreamer's life more generally. He goes so far as to claim that every dream contains a death wish. Isn't that interesting? I checked. Freud's interpretation of dreams does have in the index a series of death wish notes, but it's not well developed. This is a kind of alarming note here. Makes one think a little bit differently. Every dream contains a death wish. So that's something to consider, but also this idea, and I'll repeat that last part, interpreting a dream for Lacan often involves situating the role of death in the dream and in the dreamer's life. Why this importance of death in the dreams? It's an interesting question in Lacanian theory more generally. Lacan often makes, and often quite dramatic, mort, these references to death. And sometimes I've wondered, is this just a bit of a sort of morbid or romantic or over-the-top gesture? But I'm going to suggest, as we move forward in looking at Irma's dream, that the role of the death, or could we say the dissipation of the subject, the dissipation of the ego and the emergence of something of the subject is a very important theme. And that links, I think, to this motif of death. Last remark, also made by Bruce Fink, and it might sound like a small one, but I think it's kind of important. Fink says, Freud, I think, places quite a lot of emphasis on the accomplishment or the execution of a wish in the dream. Lacan emphasizes far more the depiction of a wish, its staging in a dream. Patients will often complain that in their dreams they seem on the verge of realizing a wish or satisfying a desire. But then something goes awry. A wish to thwart a wish, could we say. Lacan emphasizes that it's precisely when something goes awry that desire is at work. So 2 points of difference there. Where, or maybe 3, where, according to this quote, where Freud is interested in how a wish is satisfied or pictured, Lacan seems a little bit more interested in how something is thwarted, how it doesn't quite get to be pictured. This is interesting because it sounds like it's much more an index of a desiring, of a wanting that doesn't quite get pictured than the fulfillment of a wish. And that seems to lead to an attention not merely to the wishes of an ego, but rather to desires, and desires that are thwarted which have not yet been properly attained. So it's an important distinction, not only because we're not looking so much at the egoic domain of wishes per se, but we're looking at something that's much more difficult to grasp and which at some point may be ungraspable as such. In other words, desire as opposed to wish, desire of the subject as opposed to a wish of the ego, and a desire that is thwarted and gives way to yet another desire that hasn't yet been found or encapsulated. So let's stop there and we'll return to Irma's dream shortly.